everyone. I'd like to welcome you here in the Festsaal and also those who join us via the online stream to today's event entitled Ukraine from Realpolitik to Peaceful Change. It is part of our ÖFG Peaceful Change Roundtable series. And I want to, in a way of introducing this event, tell you a little bit about this ÖFG Peaceful Change and the things that we do. Martin, who sits to the left, is also part of the group. The idea was, to do research on peaceful change, understood in terms of three dimensions: restraint, compromise, and let's just easily call it dialogue. So. If there are disputes in international relations, that it's not the case that the one side lashes out against the other, but that they actually exercise restraint. Number two, compromise. So to find diplomatic solutions, meeting in the middle, making mutual concessions, even if it hurts. And number three, dialogue, to keep communication going, keep communication channels open, sometimes being even open to being persuaded to do things a little otherwise. And we've been doing this now for 3 years, and we have researched all kinds of things. Arms races, nuclear arms races, the nuclear order, international criminal networks, civil wars, wars by proxy, all kinds of things. What we have not looked at thus far is wars of aggression in the classical sense, wars of aggression. And this is obviously, given what is happening in the world right now, actually not too far away from us, what we really have to do. And although the title Peaceful Change may perhaps to some of you at the moment sound actually quite naive, there is actually something to these three dimensions, right? Restraint. So that's probably at the moment all we can hope for. Restraint sometimes follows actually the old Roman maxim, qui desiderat pacem prepararet bellum, so basically deterrence. So that's probably one of the aspects of the new world in which we are moving. Compromise. So probably one cluster of questions here will be what kind of diplomatic solutions could there be? What kind of a ceasefire agreement perhaps could there be? What kind of a status, future status for the Ukraine? How could one get there? How could such a status be guaranteed? And then finally, the dialogue, the kind of open communication, make no mistakes, also quite important. And I mean, we all look at the news, and if one actually looks at Russian domestic politics at the moment, so that there are obviously some very brave Russians in domestic politics who make themselves heard and make their opposition, their dissenting voices heard. On television, it seems even in the military. So the kind of open communication, I think, is quite important as well. I'm very, very happy that we have gathered a great group of experts here with different sets of expertise, actually. Some of them may be new to you, some of them you're very familiar with. Nevertheless, let me introduce all of them, and I do so briefly because I want to have enough time for discussion. To the right is Ambassador Dr. Emil Brix. He's the director of the Vienna School of International Studies, Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. There are lots of reasons to put him on this panel today. So he obviously had, before coming here, a great career as a diplomat in the Austrian Foreign Service, many important postings, one of them to Russia. And he met Putin on numerous occasions. He's also been associated with the Austrian Research Association for a very long time, has been the Secretary General for a very long time. And also in occasions like that, I always want to emphasize that he's a great historian, yeah? And his expertise is Central Europe, Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of things coming together. And Emil, thanks very much for being on the panel. Then to my right is Monika Polzin. She is based at the Institute for European and International Law of the Vienna University of Economics and Business. We came across your name because you commented a couple of times on Russia, and you did so very well. That's what we've detected. She specializes in public international law, including human rights, the relationship of public international law, European law, and national law, as well as European economic law. So Monika can tell us actually quite a lot about international legal provisions, about the resort to war, the conduct of war, and also the Western sanctioning regime against Russia. To my left is Martin Senn. He is heading the Department of Political Science at the University of Innsbruck. And we've collaborated for a very long time, actually starting with our common time at University College London. He is doing a lot of interesting research projects on nuclear weapons, on the international order, also increasingly actually on Austrian foreign policy and questions of neutrality. And for some of you who tune in on Twitter a lot, he's been there actually quite a lot in recent days and weeks. Yeah. So Martin, welcome to this panel as well. And then to the left is also someone I basically don't have to introduce, Ambassador Dr. Hans Winkler. He's been director here at the school for 8 years, so a very long time. We had a really great time with him, always very happy to see you here again. And I should mention that before that, obviously, too, so he had a great career in the Austrian Foreign Ministry, so really have two highly experienced diplomats here. And just a few things, perhaps. So he was Austria's permanent representative to the Council of Europe in Strasbourg. And he was part of the legal office of the Foreign Ministry for a very, very long time, headed it also for many years. And, well, he's probably best known in terms of his position as former state secretary. So Hans, thanks a lot for being here as well. And if I may, I'm gonna start my round of questions. I'll ask a few questions, and then I invite you as an audience, be it online or be it here in person, to join in as well. I'm going to start with my international lawyers in terms of what is happening now, what has happened in the last weeks, and perhaps as a way of introducing that, Hans, the American president called Putin a war criminal. Is he a war criminal?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I got a call from a former foreign minister when I was in Paris on the first day of the invasion, of the aggression, and she asked me, can I say publicly on television that Putin is a war criminal? I told her, no, we don't know that. He is a criminal in the sense that Russia is, without any doubt, committing an offense under international law. It is an aggression that is certainly against everything we know in international law, in particular Article 2.4 of the Charter of the United Nations. But he is not a war criminal in the strict sense of humanitarian law at that time. In the meantime, we see the pictures every day, and even if we assume that there is an amount of propaganda, of course, on both sides, I think, of course, Ukraine also has an interest to show things which underline their own position, but I think there can be no doubt whatsoever that the attacks against civil objects, against hospitals, against schools, theaters, against the civilian population at large is a war crime in the sense of humanitarian law.
Mm. Monika, similar question to you, and you can also just respond, but what would you say, what thus far have been the most blatant violations of international law?
I think the most blatant violation is the act of aggression. That's the most blatant, because we have such a serious violation. Okay, we have such a serious violation of the prohibition of the use of force here. And Russia has breached the prohibition of the use of force because the military invasion of Ukraine is clearly a breach of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, and there is no justification at all. The grounds Russia arguing, Russia is making legal arguments. Russia is saying it can rely on right of self-defense, but there is no reason for a right to self-defense. So Russia is making 2 points in particular. First, that there's a threat to its security interests due to the eastward bound of the NATO and Ukraine. Russia is making a case of preventive self-defense. They are arguing, though we have the Ukraine here and we have a lot of neighboring countries which start to be anti-Russia and the NATO is there and we have to act. And they're referring even to 1941 when they couldn't prevent the German invasion. They are making such a case, but this does not justify self-defense under international law, because we need an armed attack, and an armed attack has to be occurring, and there's no armed attack. There wasn't an armed attack neither by Ukraine nor by the NATO states against Russia. And this security, even if they were true, they would never amount to an armed attack, because according to the prevailing view under international law, there's no right to preventive self-defense, only in a very limited situation when we have really an imminent attack and there are no other means or no more time for deliberation, then but these are very short times. So you know in 2 days there will be an attack, so you don't need to wait until you are bombarded. But this kind of scenario that Russia is pointing, there's given no right to self-defense at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, can I just say what?
Yeah.
I have to say this phrase because it describes the situation, and as was rightly said, these excuses or justifications don't pass the straight-face test.
Mm.
I think this is a very good phrase in this connection.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so what relevance do international judicial bodies now have? So International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court?
Well, I mean, we have been we knew since 1945 that the United Nations has a birth defect. And the birth defect is, of course, the right to veto of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. And this cannot be remedied, and will not be remedied in the foreseeable future, because any change in the statute, in the charter, has to have the agreement of all 5 permanent members. So, secondly, the International Court of Justice depends very much on acceptance of its jurisdiction. And for obvious reasons, the Russian Federation, as by the way the United States in the meantime, this changed over time. Many other countries, not Austria, Austria has accepted the jurisdiction of the International Court, don't accept it. So there have to be detours in order to get to the jurisdiction. One was the allegation of Ukraine of genocide. And the International Court very quickly, by its standard extremely quickly, by an overwhelming vote of 13-2, not surprisingly the two were Russia and China, but India, for example, the Indian judge was in favor, ruled that there is reason that these allegations might be true. Therefore, the court asked the Russian Federation to stop all acts of aggression. Now, what does it in practice bring? Not much. I mean, honestly, this is realpolitik as we are discussing today. The second is international criminal courts. It has also started to look into the case of war crimes, crimes of aggression, which is a crime under international law, and of crimes against humanity. But here we also have a problem of jurisdiction, because neither the Russian Federation or Belarus accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. So international courts play a marginal role, but what they can do is they can determine and they can document that there is a large, overwhelming majority of civilized states who condemn this aggression of Russia. It's an indication. It will not change anything, to be honest. And will Putin ever land in The Hague, in a cell, like Milosevic and some of the others? I don't know. It doesn't look like now.
Monika, what do you think?
I think with the International Criminal Court, I'm not so sure, because they have jurisdiction for Ukraine, because Ukraine has submitted a special declaration already in 2014, and though they have the right to investigate war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity on the that are happening on the territory of Ukraine, they do not have the jurisdiction for act of aggression, because both parties have not ratified the Rome Statute. So I don't know. They opened the prosecution, the investigation on 2nd of March. So theoretical, they could bring open proceedings against Putin and make judgments against him, because there's no immunity in front of the International Criminal Court. So it would be theoretically possible, but
yes, a lot is theoretically possible. That is unfortunately true.
But there's still, I think that the courts are so active, and also the interim measures indicated by the ICJ they show that international law matters. Even though we cannot end the war, we can show that it's a war that is not lawful and support the states that are supporting Ukraine. I think that gives them more arguments.
Trying to move forward a little bit to explain what's happening. Emil, in terms of when we look at Putin, how can we explain so that this happens in February 2022, not say 2014 or that point in time?
Well, about the exact timing of the start of the war, it's hard to explain, but there is an obvious history to the conflict, also from the Russian and from Mr. Putin's side. When we look at the Yeltsin years, there was this liberal phraseology, which more or less said that Russia should find its place in a liberal order. And it dramatically failed from the majority of the elite population and the general public in Russia. And that was the beginning of Mr. Putin in 2000, when he from the very start had the idea that actually he had to recreate the idea of Russia. And we are seeing now that in this sort of grave for what is the Russian identity, he is ready to take any step necessary, including trespassing the door towards war. And one could see it actually from the beginning of his, in 2007, this famous speech in Munich Security Conference, that already then he said that he is no longer expecting that it's possible to be part of this liberal world order. He said, we tried. He even until nowadays says there was many famous attempts with Clinton and others to be integrated as a respectful partner in this dialogue. But in 2007 it stopped. And it took him now 15 years to go to war. Why did it take that long? Partly because he was not sure how popular it would be in Russia itself, in his own population. He had this experience that the elections went not always the way he wanted it to be. In 2011, 2012, there were large demonstrations about possible faults in the election. And then he tried already in 2014, in the case of Crimea and Donbass. And in Crimea, it was quite easy for him because he had obviously majority support by people there. In Donbass already, he realized there is a huge problem for him. And that's why the Russian troops and the separatists did not go further than they did in 2014, because this was already, that would have been the decision to start a real war already. He was not ready to do this. But from that time onwards, in all the speeches, by himself, but also by other members, the Foreign Minister Lavrov, for instance, very clear that any mean is acceptable for him to reach the objective of creating an idea of a Russian I call it now empire because he is not using the word empire. He's using sometimes the word Russian world. Sometimes he's speaking about Russia as a sort of Weltanschauung, already talking about traditional values, family, church, and so on. But it was very clear. And in 2016, he obviously asked his foreign minister to write a huge piece on the historical background of Russian foreign policy. And it's all in there already, without saying that we go to war a few years later. And he himself then later on started to write, as we know, his infamous historical pieces about how he sees that Ukraine, but also other parts of the former Russian zone of influence should belong to that. And the decisive situation happened in 2021, not so much with his article about Ukraine being a brotherly country which should actually be part of the Russian influence, but also the new national security strategy, which is often overlooked. When you look into that, he doesn't only do what the West does in national security strategies, writing about military strategy or writing about security architecture, but he wrote about how he sees that there should be an alternative security to the Western approach. It's all in this new strategy, including the fact that it needs to be an alternative. That means including the idea that there is a different Russian civilization, which can never be actually, he said, reconciled with the Western dominance. And he speaks about that the Russian culture and Russian feeling about traditional values is the core element of the identity of the Russia as he sees it. And the limit was then crossed quite easily by him when he felt that the international situation was ready, with Mrs. Merkel no longer being there, Mr. Biden having to do more with domestic affairs than with international affairs, Europe being in a sort of conference on the future of Europe, whatever this conference really means, nobody knows. And at the same time, having the COVID crisis, which helped him also to look into this unstable situation as being the right moment for starting this invasion. The surprising thing is that obviously all the information he's got was not correct about how fast he can succeed in such an invasion, and that he decided that it should be a full-scale war and not just securing the two republics in the Donbass and Crimea. So that's where we are. He decided for a full-scale war at the moment that he decided only, and at the moment it looks as if only he himself in Russia can stop this war.
Mm-hmm. In social psychology, there's this concept of groupthink, so that some leaders, they surround themselves only by people who don't say anything against them, and a smaller and smaller circle. Does that apply to Putin?
Yes, the reasons are very simple. It has to do actually with traditional thinking about how power works. When he started to recreate his idea of a greater Russia, he very much relied on the oligarchs, on the economic oligarchs, because he believed he can modernize the Russian economy and the Russian a competitive force in the world, which did not work out. And already 2012-13, he started with this trial showcases against some oligarchs who went astray and wanted to influence politics. And then he decided, actually, it's not possible to modernize Russia the way he intended originally. And it was the obvious decision then, I can only stabilize it by dominating it from the top. So this is the famous power vertical that is in Russia actually happening here. And this power vertical means that actually all decisions come from the top. And let me be very frank, everything that happened to people like Navalny, Nemtsov, Politkovskaya, the responsibility lies in such a system always with the man on the top. Because everybody below this top is actually only acting according to what he at least expects that the man on the top wants to see. And I'm not talking as in a legal case now, but this creates a lot of responsibility on one person, and that got more and more difficult, because even the stability he could not control all the time. Protests happened in the more liberal-minded younger generations in Russia, and to solve this, this idea of having an aggressive foreign policy with getting success by including other parts of the former empire was certainly also had the domestic reason that he wanted to regain or at least keep his popularity in the general public. And this has always been between 70% and 80%, his popularity, which is incredible when you look into the fact that there was not much of a real income growth for the Russian population in this period.
Martin, on top of everything else, we have to talk about nuclear matters as well. And we probably have to talk about two forms there. The one is actually the nuclear security, so that's the security of nuclear power plants. And the other one is actually nuclear weapons themselves. So what is happening there right now?
Yeah, but before I focus on the nuclear stuff, maybe just one addition to what Ambassador Brix just said. I think what we can also see in terms of the underestimation of what Ukraine is capable of and the overestimation of what Russia is capable of, I think one factor that we should talk about is this tendency of very centralized leaderships to like expect that others tell you some big news and stuff. What capabilities a state has. So, for example, what was also the case in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, when the leading scientists in the military said to Saddam Hussein repeatedly that Iraq has all kinds of weapons, all kinds of capabilities, and then at the end of the day, it turned out that it was not true. But they were just lying to him to save themselves and to get an income and not be executed. So I think this is also, there is something going on there in terms of overestimating Russian capabilities. Now to nuclear energy. So I think that the two things are very important, although whenever I talk about those issues, I repeatedly emphasize that we are talking still, fortunately, about very low chances that things will happen, but high impact if things happen, of course. So the nuclear energy issue first. So also in this respect, it was utterly irresponsible that Russian armed forces used violence in proximity to reactors for various reasons. First of all, reactors need outside energy input for the cooling systems. If this outside energy input is cut, then there are backup systems, but they don't run forever. And when the backup systems fail, then things can go terribly wrong. So this is really a dangerous act. Also, what we have in Ukraine is that right next to the actual reactors, there are large fuel storage sites where the spent fuel is located. And also, if spent fuel sites is under attack, this can create a very dangerous situation. So it's therefore not a coincidence that under international law, it's really also prohibited to attack nuclear facilities like big water facilities and other things like that. So this is a problem. The second thing, the nuclear weapons dimension, I would say we have to distinguish three scenarios. The first scenario is like a full-blown nuclear war with strategic nuclear weapons. I would say this is something that is very, very, very remote. So I'm not expecting that Vladimir Putin is a madman who really uses the Russian nuclear arsenal to attack the West. So this, I would say, we don't have to worry about at the moment. But what we should think about is a more limited use of nuclear weapons. So one thing that I find is increasingly worrying is that we're not really sure about when exactly Putin sees a Western intervention as crossing a certain threshold. Because he has repeatedly argued or basically threatened that Western intervention will be addressed with retaliation in some sorts, but we don't really know what he considers to be an intervention. So is a large-scale arms supply, is that an intervention already? Is supplying fighter jets, is that an intervention? So what I'm worrying about is that there is not a clear-cut distinction between intervention and non-intervention. So it's really like more on a scale. And there, at some point, Russia could actually consider using tactical nuclear weapons because that has also been in their doctrine for many, many years. Russian nuclear doctrine envisioned tactical nuclear weapons as a way of compensating the conventional superiority of NATO. So if now Putin sees that Western countries and NATO are intervening, are basically making it impossible for him to win this war, then I think it's not entirely impossible that he would at some point use nuclear weapons. So it's the second scenario. The third scenario is that nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, will be used by accident, by miscalculation. So we're actually seeing a shooting war right at NATO border. And this creates a high potential for miscalculation, for accidents, for really things going out of hand in this respect. And there, at some point, also nuclear weapons could be used.
It basically takes us into escalation scenarios, and then I mean, obviously, so there are quite a few of those scenarios where things could even get worse. And we know from looking at past crises in history that it is not only always something about the main protagonists, but sometimes the smaller players, they can actually participate in this escalation as well. But perhaps the more pressing question is how to manage this crisis successfully, so de-escalation. How could something like that happen, Emil? Maybe I'm going to start with you again, and I'm just going to go through the panel.
Some people, when the war started, said it's a failure of diplomacy. I think that is not a correct assessment, because diplomacy can only be used when you have two partners who are interested in diplomacy. And obviously, Mr. Putin was not interested. He felt he could not solve this conflict by diplomatic means, the Minsk process or the situation in Ukraine. So he decided against diplomacy. And I think where it's very much to do with Realpolitik now is we might end up with chances for diplomacy because of Realpolitik, because of the fact that he did not win his blitzkrieg. He did not succeed in the first 3 weeks to really conquer Ukraine. So that means either we can go on with diplomacy and we have real negotiations, which we do not have yet, or that happens what Professor Senn said, that he decides he has to use tactical nuclear weapons to make Ukraine capitulate. That's a real possibility in the mind, possibly, of Mr. Putin. But if this is not the case, then I think the chances for diplomacy are there. What we heard in the last few days is that there is a chance that security guarantees are really discussed. There is a chance that the idea of neutrality is being discussed, whatever that means in concrete terms. There is a chance that possibly also the idea of territorial integrity of the Ukraine can be secured. But we don't know yet. We hear from both sides very different stories. The story from the Russian negotiators is that the Ukraine is not interested in negotiations, that they simply want to postpone further military actions on the Russian side because they feel they need more support, weapon support from the West. And from the Ukrainian side, we hear the Russians have simply their plan to fulfill everything that Mr. Putin asked him to do. That is denazification, demilitarization, and we know all this, what they demand. So there is still a lot of way to go to start real negotiations. What makes me not so optimistic is the fact that the first real political meeting between two sides in Antalya, between the two foreign ministers, resolved nothing. The only fact was that they met, which was good for Turkey because they can prove that they, in spite of being NATO, they can act in such a way, but it did not help anything in the conflict at all. It rather escalated them, at least verbally, from both sides. The second negative thing is the way that the Russians have chosen their negotiators. The head of the delegation is Mr. Medinsky, long-time culture minister of Russia, one of the speechwriters of all this nationalistic prosa of Mr. Putin. When he had to take him out of the government because he had problems with plagiarism, actually, among other things, of his dissertation about diplomatic relations with the Habsburgs in the 16th and 17th century, he made him one of his advisors in the Kremlin for this sort of special things that he has to deal with. And so it's not a good precondition if you have this sort of background to be the chief negotiator on the Russian side. I think the chances for compromise will be decided on the battlefield, which sounds very strange, but that happens also in history quite often.
Definitely, yeah. Monika, from an international law kind of perspective, perhaps how ought a settlement look like in the future?
Oh, it's hard to say, it depends what the parties agree. International law gives them a lot of latitude how they end their conflict. And so it depends with what the parties can live, with what the Ukrainians can live, and with what Putin will be concede in order to save his face. So international law does not really lay out what they can negotiate. They have a lot of latitude.
Yeah, so we're back to the battlefield and to the
Yes.
diplomacy. Martin, what do you think? What would be a de-escalation scenario, a possible route towards ceasefire and perhaps?
Well, it depends on the time horizon that we're talking about. So right now, I think it's a good thing that communication lines are open in terms of diplomacy, but also in terms of military to military contacts, because this is something that is really important to prevent escalations by accident. Although I've read and heard that the Russians are not as interested in those contacts as their NATO counterparts, but at least there are communication lines open between the military to make sure, for example, if there is an encounter between fighter jets, that the militaries can talk to each other. So that's in the short-term time horizon. And the other thing, de-escalations, I very much agree with what Ambassador Brix said. I think it will be decided on the battlefield. Although I think this idea of neutrality is interesting. However, my concern is that what the Russians have in mind with neutrality is not really acceptable to the Ukrainians, and also not acceptable to the Western countries. But I'm sure we'll talk about this later as well.
Yes, yeah. Hans?
Well, if I knew, I would probably be a Peace Nobel Prize winner. But I agree very much with Emil that this thing will be decided on the battlefield. What they're obviously now fighting for is the acceptance of red lines. what are red lines that are under no circumstances negotiable. And I think that there we can already see maybe the outline of something. On the one hand, integrity of Ukraine is a red line for Ukraine, of the territory. Under no circumstances, in my opinion, could Ukraine consent to give away part of its territory. I'm sure they can talk about autonomy, about special regime, and I would make a distinction between the Crimea and eastern Ukraine, the Donbass. But this is a red line. I don't think that under any circumstances Zelensky could just say, okay, let the Ukraine and the Donbass go. On the other hand, it is membership in NATO and neutrality, whatever it means. I mean, I listen with great interest when I read. I read with great interest that Austria, Switzerland are under discussion. I have no idea. I mean, this is not something that we can determine here and now. There are many, many ways in looking at non-alignment of neutrality, of demilitarization. I mean, mind you, in Austria, in the state treaty, had certain restriction on weapons, on weapon systems, and all the other neutrals also had certain restrictions. So there's something to play around with. Will it come soon? I have no idea, because it very much depends on how fast or how little Russians will be able to proceed with their military goals. But I want to say something to Emil. I very much agree with you. But we have not talked about yet a possible miscalculation of Putin of the readiness of the West to react. He might, in my opinion, he very much underestimated the European Union in its unity. Because when you looked at the European Union before this aggression, it didn't look very well. I mean, it gave a picture of quarreling among itself, of one member turning against another, of the Commission taking action against members. I mean, we didn't look very, very united. But it turned out that the relation between the United States and Europe worked. B, European Union acted quite fast. I mean, I still look at this Council decision 338 and 339, which is amazing. And all members, including the neutrals, we come to that, I'm sure, because I'm very much impressed and I'm happy that Austria is participating in all of this. And it, in my opinion, and again we will talk about this, doesn't pose any legal problems whatsoever. So the EU is united and stand united against this aggression, together with the United States and with the large majority of world community. I mean, this vote in the General Assembly of the United Nations was overwhelming. Yes, there were 35 abstentions, which is a little bit, could have been better, but still, I mean, there were only 4 countries which voted with Russia, including some countries where you would say, I mean, they have always been on the side of Russia, including Kazakhstan, for example, which was shortly before saved, quote unquote, by Russian troops. So I think this united front against a blatant violation of international law should, if Putin is still rational, I don't know, I have no way in knowing this, if he's still rational, should really make him think twice in continuing.
If I may, the question, was it a miscalculation of Mr. Putin? I'm not sure. I think he knew that he was crossing a real threshold. A superpower starts a war against a major neighboring country the first time after 1945. He must have known that this sort of reaction will happen. And he knew that there were already sanctions, sort of sanctions after 14-15 in place. And he had all the information that the European Union and the West will respond with heavy sanctions. It was discussed for years. The real problem is now, did he think that we will not keep this solidarity in the West for a longer period? And I'm sure the Russians are now waiting for the first problems in our solidarity. They are looking in the discussions in Germany and Austria about gas prices and electricity bills, and that the Hungarians do not allow that weapons are transported through their country, and that Slovakia has a discussion whether there should be really NATO troops on the border to the Ukraine. So this solidarity has to be kept. And that's, for the Russian point of view, they have possibilities to work against this. Like all the propaganda efforts saying that the Russians in Western Europe are now, they have now to pay a high price for this because they are not dealt with in a normal way. They are thrown out of schools. In Russian propaganda, you see all this, how maltreated the 2.5 million Russians in Germany are now. And so they're trying to create this sort of idea that this solidarity is something maybe for the time being, but not for a longer period. And on the Russian side also there is at the same time, yesterday again, Putin in a video meeting with all the governors, which again was very long, so you can find it on the webpage of the Kremlin. He was talking mainly about how he will profit from the sanctions, because he says it will create a strong Russian solidarity and a strong Russian economy by what he called import substitution, so that they can produce whatever they need within their own country. The interesting thing about that was, and that makes me a little optimistic actually, in this last speech with his governors, he did not say what we expected, that he would try to nationalize part of the economy because it's a war situation, but he said, I think that the business community in Russia will overcome this crisis. I have to say, I was very surprised that suddenly he thinks the Russian isolation because of the sanctions can be overcome by a liberal market economy within Russia.
Will he nationalize foreign companies?
It's not a word of that in his speech. He's only saying that we will use a lot of public money, so a lot of debts will be increased, but that's not so difficult. We have learned also in Western Europe you can print money without any problems. It looks at least as if we can do that. And maybe he learned from us on this. But he really believes, and we can see it in all his speeches now, that this isolation of Russia is a good thing for creating this sort of counter-narrative to the Western dominance of the world. And he and his people even say, wow, decision in the United Nations, yes, maybe only a few countries were with us, but more than half of the population of the world is with us. I'm not sure whether he's counting it all right, but when you count India and China, you're almost there, including Russia. So there is this sort of Russian narrative that he can win this war by isolation.
May I add to this also?
Sure.
Another interesting question related to that is whether Putin really miscalculated what is happening in NATO in Europe defense-wise. So there's now this saying that Putin basically achieved what Donald Trump did not achieve and other US presidents before him, and that is a significant rise in German defense spending. But so this is one explanation, that he miscalculated and now sees a stronger NATO, which creates more problems for Russia. On the other hand, like you mentioned, one could also make a case and say, well, at the end of the day, isn't this exactly the thing that he needs to consolidate power internally? To say, well, you now see we have a massive military bloc right at our doorsteps, and they're increasing their defense spending. So I think, yes, maybe it's too early to say he has miscalculated.
And there is a reason for saying that Mr. Biden, when he said Article 5, we will defend every inch of NATO territory, was an invitation for Mr. Putin to invade Ukraine. And it makes sense. But now, on the other hand, you can say, when the Russian negotiators say neutrality may be something because we want to make sure that Ukraine doesn't become a member of NATO, that could mean that Ukraine may become a member of the European Union.
Yes, I think this is another red line as far as I'm concerned. I don't think that when was the Maidan in 2014 will not repeat itself. I don't think that this is for Ukraine a red line. Membership in the NATO, I think they have already written off. In which way needs to be decided. Neutrality means a lot of things, not all and nothing. But membership in the EU, or at least negotiations about membership in the EU, because it will in any event take years. And I'm personally very much against the fast track. Doesn't make sense. But a certain special program accelerating negotiations may be leading those negotiations in good faith. This is, I think, what the European Union must do, as it should do with the other candidates. But to renounce membership in the EU, I think, is an absolute no-go.
Let's move a little bit, or let's zoom out a little bit of that. So it was a few days after the invasion, and there was a lecture of mine here, and some of you may have been here. And I got the question: does the invasion of the Ukraine actually mark a turning point? Does that mean a new era? I said yes. But I want to ask that question to you as well. So how do you think that international order is going to develop now? And what role, and because there are all these debates now about the role of Austria and about neutrality and everything, and where does Austria stand in all of that, or where ought it stand in all of that? And I'm not going to, it's a very big question, so I'm not going to force anyone who doesn't want to, but
I hoped you would talk about Austria's position and also neutrality, because to be honest, I've been dealing with Austrian neutrality since 1970, when I started in the legal office. And I've heard a lot of nonsense about what Austria neutrality is and what it is not. But I've not really heard so much nonsense as I've heard in the last 6 weeks or so. And I'm really, I'm very glad that Austria's position, as far as it is official position, has been very clear from the very beginning. We are a full-fledged member of the European Union, and we go along with every decision of the European Union. And neutrality is not, and can never be, and should never be an excuse for not being very clear in our position. Austria's neutrality has changed since 1955 for obvious reasons. The world situation has changed. The legal framework has changed. We have adopted new legislation, new constitutional legislation in 1995 when we became a member of the European Union, and we have done so every time there was a new treaty that enhanced foreign policy and security cooperation in Europe. And we now have a legal framework that allows us, in full compliance with our obligations under international law and under neutrality law, to fully participate in everything that the European Union does. We don't have to put on the brakes. We can, and we did so on this decision 339, I think is the one with the lethal weapons. We abstained, what is called a constructive abstention, but we went along, and we do not, for example, other than Hungary, we do not block the transport of weapons over the territory of Austria. And it is not in violation of anything that neutrality forces us to do. It is in full compliance, and we changed and adapted our neutrality on stage, in full view of the whole world community. And I don't see any particular legal problems, unless, of course, you are from some Austrian party and define Austrian neutrality as being neutral in every sense of the word, in not supporting one party against the other. I think we firmly stand with the aggressed party against the aggressor.
It was a very clear statement. Who wants to?
Yeah, I don't want to talk about the Austrian position as being a German only not so long in Austria, and so I'm still ashamed of my country, what happened in the German parliament when the president of Ukraine gave a speech there. So, but I want to talk about the international order, but I think what become visible now, that I think the world order is changing and more the autocrats are coming out. And the West is losing its dominance, and we're seeing it now. And we haven't talked about China, so so here. And what I think we will witness in the future, that if you read it, the more states, in the increasing number of states, are autocrats, and a lot of democracy are witnessing a democratic backsliding. So I think in the future we will see that the international order is becoming more and more determined by autocratic state, and we have to think what this will mean about international law when autocratic states start to interpret international law. And I think this has become very visible with the Russian intervention.
Definitely.
Two big questions. Let me start with the Austrian position. I fully agree. Austria has always been clear from the very beginning. And it was brave, actually, by the Austrian government that they stated that there cannot be neutrality as far as the moral side of this issue is concerned. And we have heard that the Russians made a statement from the foreign ministry saying that they will keep in mind the Austrian position for the future.
The so-called neutrality.
The so-called neutrality that we complained. We are used to this from the Russian, more or less. And this text has been certainly formulated, I'm saying it here frankly, by the Russian ambassador sitting here, not far from this academy, and sent to the Russian foreign ministry, and he convinced them that they should do this. But what is also true, because of this situation, when we talk about the maneuvering space of Austrian foreign policy, for a distinct Austrian foreign policy, is getting smaller and smaller. Because of the solidarity, because of the fact that we are more and more integrated also in the security concepts of the European Union, because we are getting closer and closer to NATO partnerships and all these sort of things. So our distinct Austrian foreign policy in the given situation and in the near future is certainly getting smaller. And what remains there, and again, I have to talk from the point of view of the political aspects of neutrality. It is always the question, does the international community think we need neutrality of a certain country? And I'm afraid we all think that we neutrals have some sort of moral right to be neutral. But just to remind ourselves of the Austrian case, it was the Russians in '55 who said, if you want to have the state treaty, we have to be neutral. And we all know that there was this illusion, political illusion, that legally we had first a state treaty, and then only after everything was clarified and no foreign soldiers anymore in Austrian territory, we decided on this constitutional law of permanent neutrality. But this was a case which again showed that neutrality is a child of its time, of what's happening around the country. And in Ukraine, this might happen. It might be that the Russians, with their proposal of a neutrality for the Ukraine, are thinking about the Austrian case of 55. That was the best they could achieve in the given situation, with all the differences. So I don't think that this is the best time for a neutral to say, hey, look, we are the right ones. It's rather a time where we see that neutrality comes often in a given situation as a solution to a conflict which goes beyond the national interest of the one who is neutral or will be neutral. So we have also to keep in mind. So there will be less and less possibility to really live a different life as a neutral within the future European order. About that, I am sure, and we will find always legal ways to explain that we are still neutral. Yes. And as far as the global order is concerned, big question. It is certainly a success of the Russian that we are going to live in a multipolar world. That's what they always asked for. There is a Western dominance. We don't accept this. The future has to be a multipolar world where they want to be one of the poles, which is more difficult because of China. But that will be the outcome. It's not conceivable that this sort of end of history story can continue after what's happening in front of our eyes. So there is a curtain coming down. There is a superpower separation between the blocks in the future order. The question is, will we need a new European Security Conference? My guess is we will, but we have to decide, will it be a conference without the Russians or with the Russians? At the moment, most Western leaders say, no, we need the conference, but without the Russians. I'm not sure how it will look like in a few years' time. And then the question is that as we will nothing change in the United Nations, I guess, Hans, you will agree that a reform in the United Nations is a nice word, but there's no chance. It will all happen, as you said in your title, in Realpolitik, but not as a legal basis of how we organize the world. So we'll have much more Realpolitik. We will have a confrontation of blocks, and then the decision will have to be made, what is the role of Europe? Is it one of them, or is it just part of a transatlantic partnership? At the moment, Europe is saying we see that we need the US, and it has to be transatlantic. And my own political wish would be that we should learn that Europe should be one of those actors and not be only a Beiwagerl, as we say in German, of the Americans, or as we know with the poodle and who wags the tail should not be our future.
Markus, may I just, because it's often said, and you also hinted, we interpret our neutrality a little bit away and we go around it. Let me be very clear. You might like it or you might not like it, but as long as we have a constitutional law on permanent neutrality, we are neutral. And there is absolutely no perspective in the near future, I would even say in the long run, that the Austrian population would want to change that. First of all, you need a constitutional majority in parliament, a two-thirds, which is not in sight. And it will not be in sight for a long time. Secondly, all parties agree, have agreed for a long time now, that there will be a referendum. It's not legally necessary, but there will be one. And I mean, there's still about 2/3 of the Austrian population which want to keep that status. You might like it, you might say it would be better if we join NATO. That's not the point. The point is that Austria is still neutral and will remain a neutral country. If we are still neutral under international law, that is a debate that scholars, and I've participated in many debates, argue a lot about. And I could tell you that a majority of the scholars are of the opinion that we're not neutral anymore in an international law sense. But we are, as the constitutional order of Austria is concerned, we are neutral and will remain so.
Sorry, but
I think
I respectfully disagree with you, because if you look at the constitutional law and Article 23J, then this opens the door to participating in the Petersburg Task. It opens the door to mutual defense.
Yes.
So in this respect, I would argue we are no longer neutral. We are neutral because we can take the exit of the Irish clause, yes, but that's European law. But for Austrian law, with regards to European Union missions, we are no longer neutral. And this is one point that I would really like to emphasize, and a point that is really highly problematic in Austria. And we have slowly but steadily decreased the scope of our neutrality, in particular in the context of the European Union. At the same time, what has happened is that we have slowly and steadily decreased the political debate about neutrality, what neutrality actually means, which now puts us in a position that on the one hand we are really glad to learn that NATO countries, European NATO countries, will come to defend the neutral and the alliance-free countries. So we are really glad about this, but we have not made up our minds what it really means if a European country is attacked. What would Austria's contribution be? Because Article 23J gives us a lot of space to act, but we don't have the political will to act at the moment, I would say, and this is a problem. So this is
Excuse me. The core obligations of neutrality remain intact. We cannot join a military alliance, and we cannot allow foreign military bases on the territory of Austria. Everything else is a question of political will, of interpretation, of change in our constitution, but the basic concept of neutrality in its original form is the joining a military alliance, which means NATO. So we cannot join NATO. That is the basic obligation of our international neutrality. And yes, we can participate in all these missions, and we should, because we are a member of the European Union in solidarity. And that is, I personally think this is very good so.
And we can even send to the Ukraine at the moment helmets and security vests.
Yes, because of 339 or 38, I don't know which was.
Yeah, we only had to make sure that we don't call it weapons, because that would be difficult.
We could participate within the European Union action to finance the sending of military equipment, and we could also, because neutrality does not apply within the scope and the limits of this Council decision.
But your former legal office had to work hard to make it possible that our army sends these helmets and vests by explaining they are not they are not weapons, and they have only some sort of civilian use. Not to be in this discussion about whether it's against neutrality or not. You know that.
I think at this point, I could go on forever with this, but I think at some stage I have to give you the opportunity to ask questions as well. And I anticipate quite a few of them, so we're always going to do batches of 3. And we have Melusine, who's going to run from person to person, and she always likes it if I call on people who sit about at the same place. So we're going to do 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So on the very right-hand side from my yeah.
Good evening. Thank you very much for this very lively discussion. My name is Isabel, and my question can be for whoever would like to ask. So the strategic shock that this war represents to Europe is going to demand more far-reaching responses from Europe.
Excuse me, is it permitted to take off the mask? Because
we
hard
have
to
to
understand,
it's
yeah.
hard, yeah.
Should I start again?
Yes, please.
Isabel,
So
yeah.
the war in Ukraine is representing a strategic shock to Europe, which is realizing that needs more, but broader response to what is happening, because like we find ourselves with our hands kind of tied. And my question is, do you think that what's coming next, is there space for a peaceful approach or a peaceful framework, or is it going to slide into the realist paradigm again? Thank you.
The power politics one, yeah. And then the second one, yes, please.
Good evening. First of all, I'm very grateful that we have the option to discuss today. I have a question to Ambassador Brix. Having mentioned that there is coming new curtain, for instance, I just want to highlight the fact that probably the word of the year is going to be Zelensky. Zelensky, for instance, in Slavic languages means green. Green represents renewal and resurrection. Therefore, are we seeing renewal of new Zelensky curtain, which could be the curtain between the West and the East in Donbass and Ukraine, Donbass and Crimea? So therefore, could we say that Zelensky, the word Zelensky will represent the new Cold War with resurrection, actually? Thank you.
And then, yes.
First of all, thank you very much for this interesting talk. I'm Alexandra. We quickly touched on the confrontation of two blocks, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on the role of China, and because I think China plays a very essential role. I don't know if it is really in the self-interest of China to build a bloc with Russia, and I would be interested in your opinion on this. Thank you very much.
China is sometimes even considered to be a possible mediator, right? Which would be, but I'm not gonna. I'm just doing the moderation. I'm not saying anything. Who wants to go? Whoever. Maybe we can always go. Yes.
About Zelensky and
Mike.
Sorry, Mike. I had a question about Zelensky and the coming down of a new curtain and Cold War. Yes, it looks very likely that we are going into a confrontation which will last for quite some time, and that it's different from the war in Georgia or the war in even the war in Transnistria in the early 90s, and this has to do actually with the first question, because the words that are used by analysts nowadays are mostly containment and deterrence. And these are very similar terms, actually, when you look at them. And these are Cold War terms, as we know. And the Russians are not so unhappy, I have the feeling, about this. Because that's what at least the Kremlin wants to see, that they are different. They have their spheres of influence, and they are in favor of these sort of clear borders, I'm afraid. And so we should be careful not to fall into the trap of only talking about this in this sort of war of words that come up. So I'm not very happy that Mr. Biden speaks about a war criminal as a president. That should be for other people to say, like us here. But I could give you similar radical words from Mr. Putin on the other side. He speaks about his own Russian people who are open to the West of rats, or insects which have to be spit out onto the parquet, he said yesterday.
Yeah, and used the term purging.
And to the China question from my side, I think China is in a very uneasy position at the moment. Even the fact that Xi accepted today to speak to Mr. Biden showed that he doesn't feel very easy. Some people even say that Mr. Lavrov was 2 days ago on his way to Beijing to discuss with his homologue, and when he was informed that there would be the talk between Biden and Xi, the plane turned around. It's true that the plane turned around in the middle of Siberia, but we're not sure whether Mr. Lavrov was really on it. But it showed you something. It showed you that China plays an important role in this game, and that from the Chinese point of view, the best thing would be to find a solution which would weaken both the West and Russia. Possibly they can manage that. And if they cannot manage that, I think they will look for a solution which helps us to get out of the economic situation, which is not good for China, what's happening now at this moment. I don't think that they will finally take one of the sides. Their analysts, I'm sure, think it's too early to make a decision on this.
Whoever else?
On China, I very much agree with Emil Brix. They must feel very uncomfortable right now. And it's certainly not in their interest that this war escalates. And for them, it means, in a sense, also a strategic problem. For example, Taiwan is much more, the reunification is much more distant now, because it is unthinkable that sometimes you read that they would use this crisis now to also try to bring in Taiwan into the homeland, like Putin wants to bring Ukraine into the homeland. I see the contrary is happening, because the United States would not once again just say, okay, we will not interfere militarily. The question will always be open. What would the United States do in the case of an attack against Taiwan? So China, I think, must have a genuine interest in trying to help the two parties to come to a solution. How far they will expose themselves, I don't know, but I could imagine that they play a certain role. And to the other question, yes, there is a new division in Europe, there's absolutely no doubt. Although it is different from the Cold War that we used to know until 1989, in a sense. From 1945 to 1989, roughly now, there was a fight for influence zones. There was black and white, and in between there was gray, and the two blocs tried to get as much of this gray zone they could. Right now, in the foreseeable future, I don't see Russia again having zones where they have an undisputed influence. There might, of course, there will always be marriages of convenience, but I don't think that Russia can in any way control certain areas in Africa, in Asia, and they will remain pretty isolated, I think, for some time now.
Anyone else? Yes.
So on this question on power politics and deterrence, so what we will most likely see in the mid to long term is more pressure towards nuclear weapons, nuclear armament. So this has two dimensions. One, what is very likely is that the current modernization programs of nuclear weapon states will accelerate. So for example, if you look at Germany, where the incoming government basically at least played a bit with the idea of going out of nuclear sharing in NATO. I mean, leaving the nuclear dimension of NATO now would be political suicide. I mean, as you probably have heard, Germany has decided on acquiring new aircraft for also delivering nuclear weapons. So this will be very much on the agenda for the next couple of years. And I would assume that there will be strong pressure for rearmament, nuclear rearmament also in NATO. So that's one dimension. So we will see more arms dynamics, which would make nuclear arms control even more necessary. But the problem that we have there is that the architecture of nuclear arms control has been eroding for 2 decades. So, and the second dimension that we will see is that there will be many arguments be made about why countries should acquire nuclear weapons. And this is the myth that is out there. If Ukraine had kept nuclear weapons, they would have been in a position to deter Russia. I totally and absolutely disagree with this hypothetical scenario. If you want to learn more, I'm very happy to talk about this. But this argument will be made more forcefully in the next couple of years, and some decision makers will learn the lesson. And so we could also see more countries at least playing with the idea of acquiring nuclear weapons.
I'm gonna hike up the number of questions per batch to 5, because I think otherwise it's going to be a very long trip. Maybe let's do this side now. Yeah, Medicine just in front of you. Yeah.
Hello. My name is Maxim. I would like to ask Ambassador Brix, and who else would like to comment? Ambassador, you were talking about European Union, of European solidarity in face of Russian aggression. And you said that probably Russians are waiting for any sign of weakness in this situation, or maybe even probably they are doing their best to create this weakness. And here comes the question: how do you think, in which way this solidarity could be possibly destroyed, or maybe some country or some situation will be created to make it weaker? And from the other hand, if this solidarity will remain, can you imagine how far it may come? For example, now we have financial support, we have weapons supplying. Can you imagine situation, for example, when American Air Force or NATO Air Force will strike Russian troops in order to roll them out from Ukrainian territory? Thank you.
Thank you. Miriam, so in the middle.
Hello, my name is Miriam, and I am a student here at the Diplomatic Academy. And for when we get here, one of the first courses that we have is called Principles of International Law. And I'm wondering, as we've seen nothing but sanctions, so no real consequences after 2014 and the Crimea situation, or annexation basically, I'm wondering if you could now say that a principle of international law is you can do anything basically if you're one of the P5 in the Security Council. I'm just wondering, do you think there will be a substantial change in the international order, especially in the UN, to the extent where that may be not a principle anymore, so that there's severe consequences other than severe economic sanctions, if you want, if a permanent member who has a veto trespasses in terms of especially aggression against other states? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I may just add, this is for my own self-interest. So the Uniting for Peace resolution, 1950s, and basically, so what is happening now? A little bit modeled after that. It seems to me how far something like that could go to add to that. Yes, and then we're gonna move out of it. Well, actually, sorry, Michelangelo is on your way. So yeah.
Hi. Thanks. So I have a question which is actually 2 questions. The first part relates to this possible entry of Ukraine into the European Union. Because in a certain sense, entering to the European Union for many Central and Eastern European countries has been tied with sort of moving away from Russia as in the Soviet Union, moving towards the West in that sense, which now can be sort of interpreted as the bridge that unites the old Iron Curtain to this new one, where Russia has moved once again to new values, this new Weltanschauung. And so my question is, supposing that a post-war, neutral, demilitarized Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, how would that change the European Union? Would that make the European Union necessarily more open to Russia, more open to influence from Russia, having to perhaps enter into a less sort of value-based stance against Russia, or would it simply lead back into a situation of conflict for Ukraine? And the other side of the question is the fact that this new Weltanschauung, this new values that Putin's Russia has sort of gained, has led, on the other side, to this wonderful friendship with China, no? That some people say won't last long, but still the fact is that Central Asia is in a situation of, you could say, stability. No? And this is a bit of a provocation. In the paradoxical case that Russia had followed the sort of path of European integration that Yeltsin started, wouldn't Ukraine be happening in Central Asia right now, in Kazakhstan or in Mongolia? Think about the Kazakhstan protests. Had Russia, a liberal Russia, supported the protesters as the EU did in Maidan, what would China's reaction have been? So perhaps, is there a sort of stability creating place for this Russian empire, as the Russian propaganda says, in this multipolar world? So that's the other question. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, and then we can... Yes.
Until recently, I think Eastern Europe was mainly just a blank spot on the map, but now with the attention on Ukraine, I was just wondering, what do you think it will be the relationship between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, how this will change?
And then, Melusine, you can stay put, because there were these, yeah.
Thank you for your insights and your knowledge that you're sharing with us tonight. My name is Gabriel, and I wanted to ask you a question related to sanctions and international law, because in recent days they are talking about a 5th round of EU sanctions, and some EU officials have told the press that if Mr. Putin was to increase the level of attacks on civilians and do something even more terrible than even the hardest sanctions, like meaning oil and gas blockade, then could really come to the table. And first of all, I want to ask you what kind of event that could be, and whether it would really trigger the next level of really hard-hitting sanctions. Thank you.
And apologies to the panelists. There are so many hands still going up. I'm simply going to go down the list now, and then you all have the possibility to respond. I mean, in measure, actually. You had your hand up. Melusine. First row. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for this very interesting talk, and thank you also particularly for disagreeing openly. I think that's really helpful. Really, honestly.
It is. No, that's part. I mean,
a critical approach.
Yes.
My name is Carmen, and my question goes particularly to you, Ambassador Brix. You elaborated on Putin's view or vision of this Russian world, of Russian empire, as you called it. And then we were talking about a neutral Ukraine, and I'm wondering, how can this work out? I mean, is there really a way for a neutral Ukraine, a lasting and secured neutrality? Isn't there a contradiction in that? Is it enough for Putin to have a neutral Ukraine? And if so, how can it work out? What securities are necessary? Thank you.
Okay, and then I do one more, Luca, and then because it's getting too much. Otherwise, I'm sorry about that. In the first row, yeah.
Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. My name is Luca.
Take your mask.
Yes, the mask. Sorry. I have a question for Professor Polzin. The question is fairly short, but it's complicated. Taking into account the fast track option, what do you think of it from the legal perspective of fast track for Ukraine in the accession procedures, and how would this legally then even look like? how does this change the legal framework of the accession process? Thank you.
Okay, so then I really apologize, but we have a reception afterwards, and then you can ask questions in an informal way. Okay, and so that's our last round now. I suggest we go again from my right to the left, and so anything that comes to your mind, number of questions, also in terms of concluding remarks.
Happy to start the round. The first question was actually about will this solidarity last, and which way will it go? The solidarity, I think, is rather fragile. In the words of Western leader, it looks very stable, but I think it is not that stable. But everybody expects that in a few months' time, the oil and gas embargo will come. Nobody will say so at the moment, but the more we make sure that we have alternative sources coming to Germany, Austria, and other parts, the pressure on the West, on the public mind, will be so strong that the embargo will come against Russia. And I don't know how the escalation on the other side will be, what the response will be. I was always of the opinion, as a historian, sanctions do not work. I can't find of good examples where they really changed the course of politics of the country against which the sanctions were done. Not even the Iran is a case in point, I would say. But maybe, from what you hear the last few days, also how Putin and his people react, you get the idea that it hurts. And it may be that the last step necessary might be this embargo of oil and gas, in spite of all the repercussions in the Austrian, on the European side. Second question for me was the question about stability. Ukraine, EU member, what will be the relations for Russian relations with Russia? And that's actually also the question about a neutral Ukraine. Would that be a stability factor or a factor of instability? The Austrian case showed that it can be a factor of stability. You may say that Ukraine is a bit larger than Austria, and it is not surrounded by other countries which are not directly either West or Russia. So I cannot give you an answer, but as a pragmatist, I would say the best we can achieve, likely, is that we, for the time being, have a neutral Ukraine. And I would say the moment that we have negotiations of Ukraine with the European Union which lead to membership, then it actually, again, it's a different stability, but again, it's a stable situation. And we had situations in a Cold War period where there were no gray zones between, but there was a clear-cut Iron Curtain. So the Iron Curtain then would be, I feel, would be on the eastern side of the Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. There is no way that Ukraine will stay open for both sides. I don't see the chance for this. And for me, it might be a stable system, but it will take years. By the way, I'm in favor of a fast-track approach. Not your position. I think Bosnia and Ukraine need a fast-track approach as a symbol of commitment of the European Union towards these countries. And it has nothing to do with that other Balkan countries may see this as a negative attitude towards them, but it is a commitment that I think we should give to these countries. And then I was asked whether this new Western-Eastern European divide is a game-changing situation. Yes, because after 1989 we thought it's not necessary any longer to have this sort of clear separation. between West and East. So the countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, they could pick and choose to a certain extent. And that is one of the problems that we have in the present-day European Union, that some of our Eastern Europe, or Central European, as I call them, member states, try to profit from this. And at the same time, they said correctly that the Western Europeans do not understand that we have a different historical experience regarding our Eastern partners. I think this has changed. This is now really, it's not a question of East-Western parts of the European Union, it's really a question of the European Union vis-à-vis Russia. But actually the problem is in between still Moldova. I'm not laughing about the issue, but I'm laughing about because I don't know what will happen to a country like Moldova in such a situation. Well, and then the last question I was sort of asked is about escalation. There is still a spiral of escalation. I mentioned it in the case of sanctions. Very likely that it will still escalate. From the Russian side, there are possibilities of escalation still in the hybrid sphere, which they will certainly try to use. And rhetorically, the escalation may continue wherever it's see. When I followed the Russian media and what Putin and his colleagues say, then the wording is more and more radical. It's every day more and more radical. At the same time as they're saying we negotiate with the Ukrainians. That tells me at least what we are having here is certainly a conflict in Ukraine, but it's more than that. It is simply escalating into a real East-West division, which will be decided quite soon what's happening. I stop here because I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I still believe at the end there will be a stable system for a few years coming at least. But I'm not sure whether I like what I expect to be this stable system like.
Just very brief to your answer, whether international law has died, But I'm thinking the contrary. International law is much alive because we have the General Assembly resolution saying the General Assembly deplores Russia's aggression and violation of the prohibition of the use of force. So international law is much alive. The problem is that we have a serious breach, but you would never discuss that we do not have national criminal law any law because someone has murdered his wife. So international law is quite alive and gives huge legitimacy to the countries supporting Ukraine, and it's quite clear that Russia has violated international law. It's not doubted under apart from Russia, but even Russia is making arguments based on international law. But they are making not very convincing arguments, and it's a shame. But they are not saying we can do whatever. They say we rely on Article 51, even with fraudulent arguments. So I think international law is much alive, and my students are more eager to learn international law now. It's I think it's much alive, and to you it's just too complicated for it's a quarter to and I think, and you have to think whether it's wise or not, and not making emotional decisions now and then. Russia wins the war and then Russia sits in the council. So we should be careful.
Careful for afterwards, Martin.
Many questions. So. On the Ukraine neutrality, I also see many question marks at the moment. So if it's really like neutrality Austria 1955, that means without security guarantees, why would Ukraine accept this? I mean, for obvious reasons. If it's neutrality with security guarantees, the obvious question is, so who is the guarantee giver? And would those guarantees be robust? So obviously, Russia cannot be the guarantee giver. the United States, I would say, are hesitant, and Europe cannot really be the guarantee giver because they are not credible. So who's left? Turkey? I don't see that. So I think this is something, although I see neutrality as an option, I don't really see how this neutrality can be designed so that it's really acceptable for all involved players, meaning Russia, Ukraine, and the West. So at the moment, I don't see it, but I would very much hope that neutrality turns out as an option to stop the killing. On the consequences or basically that great powers don't have to fear any consequences, and whether this could change in terms of also changing the UN system. So I'm highly skeptical whether this war now will lead to a change in the UN system for the obvious reasons, because the threshold is very high. I mean, there's not a lack of plans how to reform the Security Council and things like that, but the threshold is very high. However, what I would not underestimate is the consequences that Russia's war has in terms of everyday diplomacy and the practical dimension of diplomacy. That Russia is really very much isolated within the UN. So what was for me very interesting yesterday, maybe you also have seen it, on Twitter there was, because you mentioned me being on Twitter, so I have to refer to Twitter as well. So on Twitter there was a posting by the Canadian representation in New York at UN. And what they did, they took the Russian draft resolution and really basically marked it down with comments and changed things with red ink, the Canadians. So you can already see that that there's really strong resistance in everyday diplomacy, and that Russia is really very much pushed to the sidelines, and this of course also hurts them. So I think yes, you're right. Formally, there is no way that you can constrain a great power within the UN system. You can sanction them, yes, but you cannot change the architecture of the system. But in everyday diplomacy, I think very much can be done and has been done recently. Yeah, I want to end on that note. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. Okay, being the last one, I'll be reasonably short. To answer your question about the means to respond to aggression, I'll be very clear. There are no means other than the two famous exceptions that you've learned in international law, self-defense and a decision of the Security Council. And uniting for peace is definitely not an option. If you let the majority of the General Assembly decide about the use of force, Israel wouldn't be alive anymore, for example. It is, first of all, it's not foreseen in the Charter. It's not going to happen. This might be unfortunate. It is a weakness of international law. And yes, international law is alive and well, and that's public opinion, world opinion. But when it comes to the use of force, to answer the use of force, there is no way except these two exceptions that we know. Secondly, neutrality. When we talk about neutrality, we always have to talk about security guarantees. I agree with you, we can not really imagine who would the guarantor be. But I don't think it's a question of being one country or a group of countries. We're talking about a system of guarantees. And I would have enough imagination to come up with some ideas. Nobody asks me, but I think this is possible. And yes, Austria is a good example. I mean, we were right in the middle of East and West at the time, and they were at each other's throat at the time. And Austria was offered a guarantee by the Soviet Union, which we wisely refused to accept. So in the end, I think neutrality plus a system of guarantees is an option. And thirdly, there were two questions which tie into each other. Your question was, can there be another turn of the screw when the situation deteriorates, an embargo of oil and gas? I don't quite agree with you, Emil, that this will in the near future come, because here comes the other question. This is one of the points where probably there's not a consensus, at least in the European Union. And there will not be a consensus in the, I don't want to quantify it, but in the next couple of years or so. Because honestly, we just can't afford it. Not now, and not in a year, maybe in 3 years or 4 years. And it's the good thing, if there's a good thing, I mean, I'm hesitant to call it a good thing, Europe will become more independent of oil and gas imports. But what are we exchanging it for? We're exchanging it against liquefied natural gas, which is very detrimental to the environment. We are discussing in the European Union already of using power plants, coal power plants a longer time. We're using up the renaissance of nuclear power. So I'm not so sure that this debate goes in the right direction. But in the short run, I don't think that Europe as a whole, and some countries in particular, like Germany and Austria, can actually give up its reliance on oil and gas, and to a certain extent also on Russia as a provider of oil and gas.
So thank you very, very, very much. It's been a long discussion. I could probably have gone on for even, I don't know, 2 more hours or so. But thanks a lot for bearing with us. Thanks a lot for your questions. Many, many thanks for the panelists. It was really a great discussion. I greatly enjoyed it. And I invite you all, those who are here in person, to join us at the reception, and we can continue the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Okay.